Hi, my name is Cordelia, and this past Easter, my daughter-in-law Ravenna called me useless and a burden in front of my entire family because I wouldn't babysit her twins while she went on a spa weekend. But that wasn't the worst part. She'd been poisoning my son against me for 3 years, systematically isolating me from my grandchildren and convincing everyone I was just a bitter old widow clinging to the past. What she didn't know was that this useless woman had been quietly building a financial empire worth $2.3 million in accounts she never knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought justice would look like empty bank statements and a foreclosure notice. But maybe that's what happens when greed meets its match in patience and planning. Before we begin, what time is it where you are? And have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew everything about you? Tell me below, because this story doesn't end the way anyone expected, especially not Ravenna. You see, for the past 15 years since my husband Garrett passed away, everyone assumed I was just scraping by on Social Security and his modest pension from the railroad. They saw a 67-year-old woman in thrift store cardigans, clipping coupons at the grocery store in Millfield Creek, driving the same dented Honda Civic I had had since 2009. What they didn't see were the investment accounts I had been building under my maiden name, Cordelia Ashworth, or the 3 rental properties I'd quietly purchased in neighboring Riverside Commons, or the cryptocurrency portfolio I'd been nurturing since 2018 when everyone said I was too old to understand technology. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Easter Sunday at my son Jasper's sprawling colonial house in Elmwood Heights. The kind of house that screams, "We've made it," with its perfectly manicured lawn and imported Italian marble countertops. The house that I'd helped them buy with a loan of $50,000 that somehow never got mentioned anymore in family conversations. I arrived that morning at 10 a.m. sharp, carrying my famous lemon meringue pie, the one that Ravenna always claimed was too sweet but somehow disappeared entirely by the end of every gathering. I was wearing my best Easter dress, a soft lavender number I'd found at Goodwill, but had tailored to fit perfectly. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make anyone think I had money to spare. Ravenna answered the door in a designer sundress that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments, her platinum blonde hair styled in those effortless waves that actually take 2 hours and a professional stylist to achieve. She looked me up and down with that expression I'd come to know so well, barely concealed disdain mixed with fake sweetness. "Oh, Cordelia," she said, using my full name the way some people say plague, "you're early. I was hoping to get the house perfect before anyone arrived." The implication was clear. My presence somehow made the house less perfect. I smiled and stepped inside, taking in the Easter decorations that looked like they'd been lifted straight from a magazine spread. Every detail was pristine, expensive, calculated. The kind of home that looked beautiful but felt cold, like a museum where real life wasn't quite welcome. "The pie smells wonderful, Mom," my son Jasper said, appearing from the kitchen with flour dusting his expensive golf shirt. At 35, he still had my late husband's kind eyes, but lately they seemed to look through me rather than at me. Ravenna and I were just discussing our summer plans. "Oh yes," Ravenna practically purred, sliding her arm through Jasper's possessively. "We're thinking of renting that beach house in Coral Bay for the entire month of July, just us and the twins, a real family vacation." The emphasis on real family wasn't lost on me, but I just nodded and complimented the lovely table settings. What was the point in mentioning that Coral Bay was where Garrett and I had honeymooned 42 years ago, or that I'd been the one to suggest it to them months earlier? The rest of the family began arriving. Jasper's sister Lydia, with her husband and their teenage daughter, my brother-in-law Frederick, and various cousins and family friends, all lovely people who treated me with the kind of polite affection reserved for elderly relatives who are expected to fade quietly into the background. During the dinner preparation, I offered to help, as I always did. I'd been cooking Easter dinner since before Ravenna was born, after all. but she waved me away with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh no, Cordelia, you just sit and relax. Cooking for this many people might be too much for you at your age. Besides, I have a very specific vision for today." I sat in the living room watching through the archway as she orchestrated the meal like a conductor leading a symphony. Everything had to be perfect, photographed and posted to social media with carefully curated captions about blessed family moments and making memories. But it was during the gift exchange that everything changed. You see, I'd brought something special for my 6-year-old twin grandchildren, Harmony and Phoenix. Handcrafted wooden puzzles I'd commissioned from a local artisan, each one depicting a different constellation and including a small booklet about astronomy that I'd written myself. The children were delighted, immediately sitting on the floor to work on the puzzles while asking me to tell them about the stars. It was one of those perfect moments, 3 generations connected over wonder and learning. That's when Ravenna decided to make her announcement. "Actually, kids, Grandma Cordelia won't be able to babysit you anymore like she used to." Her voice was bright and cheerful, but her eyes were as cold as winter. "She's getting older, and it's just too much responsibility. We need to be realistic about what she can handle." The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a family gathering, but the tense silence that falls when everyone senses conflict brewing, but no one wants to acknowledge it. "I never said I couldn't," I began gently. "It's okay, Cordelia," Ravenna interrupted, her voice dripping with false kindness. "We all know it's hard to admit when we're not as capable as we used to be. It's perfectly natural. You've been, well, let's just say, helpful in your own way, but the twins need more active supervision now, more energy than someone your age can provide." What she really meant was that I'd refused to drop everything and babysit that weekend so she could go to some luxury spa retreat with her book club friends. What she really meant was that I'd had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, parents should sometimes arrange their social lives around their children's needs rather than expecting grandparents to be on-call childcare services. But the way she said it, with that patronizing tone and that fake sympathetic smile, made it sound like I was declining due to my own limitations, rather than because I had boundaries. And that's when she delivered the line that would change everything. "I mean, let's be honest," Ravenna continued, looking around the table at my family, my son, my brother-in-law, everyone I loved most in the world. "What would Cordelia even do with her time if she wasn't trying to help us? It's not like she has her own life or anything important going on. She's basically, well, useless, isn't she? And at her age, being useful is really the only currency she has left." The words hit like a physical blow. Useless. At 67 years old, after raising 2 children as a single mother when Garrett died young, after working 3 jobs to put both kids through college, after quietly supporting this family in ways they'd never even noticed, I was useless? I looked around that beautiful dining room, at the faces of people I'd loved and sacrificed for my entire adult life, waiting for someone to defend me, waiting for my son to speak up, for someone to say that was too far, that I deserved better. The silence stretched on like an eternity. And that's when I realized that maybe it was time for them to discover just how useless I really was. But this story doesn't end with hurt feelings or family drama. It ends with justice, liberation, and the sweetest revenge money can buy. Stay with me, because what happened next will change everything you think you know about underestimating the quiet ones. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who thought they had you all figured out? Share your story below, because sometimes the most powerful people are the ones everyone overlooks.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. To understand how devastating that Easter dinner really was, you need to know what my life looked like before Ravenna entered the picture. You need to see the woman I was before she systematically dismantled everything I'd built with my son and grandchildren. 3 years ago, I wasn't sitting alone at family dinners being called useless. I was the heart of this family, the one everyone turned to when life got complicated. My little house on Maple Street in Millfield Creek might have looked modest from the outside, a simple 2-bedroom ranch with peeling paint and a garden that had seen better days, but it was Grand Central Station for the people I loved. Back then, Jasper would stop by every Tuesday after work, usually around 6:30, still wearing his suit from his job at Meridian Financial, but with his tie loosened and that tired but happy expression of a man who'd had a good day. We'd sit at my kitchen table, the one that Garrett had built by hand in 1987, and he'd tell me about his cases, his frustrations with office politics, his dreams of maybe starting his own practice someday. "Mom, you always know exactly what to say," he'd tell me, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "I don't know what I'd do without these talks."
The twins, who were only 3 then, would run straight to my arms whenever Jasper brought them over. Little Harmony with her wild curls that never stayed in ponytails, and Phoenix with his serious eyes that reminded me so much of his grandfather. They'd help me tend my vegetable garden, their tiny hands planting seeds, while I told them stories about how plants grow strong with patience and proper care. "Grandma Cordelia, why do the tomatoes take so long?" Phoenix would ask, his small fingers covered in soil. "Because the best things in life can't be rushed, sweetheart," I'd tell him, not knowing how prophetic those words would become. "They need time to develop their strength." Harmony would giggle and try to water the plants with my oversized watering can, usually soaking herself in the process. Those afternoons were pure gold, the kind of memories that sustain you through darker times. I was the one they called when Phoenix had nightmares and wouldn't settle down. I was the one who taught Harmony to braid friendship bracelets during rainy weekends. When Jasper needed someone to watch the twins for date nights or work events, I was always available, always reliable, always grateful to spend time with my grandchildren. My relationship with my daughter Lydia was equally strong back then. She lived 40 minutes away in Brookhaven, but we talked on the phone every Sunday morning over coffee. She'd call right at 9 a.m., and we'd chat for an hour about everything and nothing. Her teenage daughter Chloe would sometimes spend entire summer weeks at my house, helping me preserve peaches and learning family recipes that had been passed down for generations. "Grandma, teach me how to make Grandpa's apple butter again," Chloe would say, pulling her dark hair back into a messy bun. "I want to make some for my friends at school." Those were the days when I felt vital, needed, purposeful. I wasn't just existing, I was actively contributing to the lives of people who mattered to me. My small house was filled with laughter, with the chaos of family dinners where everyone talked over each other, where the twins would help me set mismatched plates, and Jasper would carve whatever roast I'd prepared. But even in those golden days, there were subtle signs I should have paid more attention to. Little comments that seemed innocent at the time, but now feel like early warning sirens. "Your mom is so traditional," Ravenna would say to Jasper when she thought I was out of earshot, loading the dishwasher after Sunday dinner. "Don't you think the twins should be exposed to more sophisticated influences as they get older?" Or, "I love how quaint your mother's house is, but I do worry about the twins running around unsupervised in that overgrown backyard. Safety standards had changed so much since we were kids." She never said anything directly critical. Ravenna was far too clever for that. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, tiny suggestions that maybe my old-fashioned ways weren't quite good enough for her children, that perhaps my judgment wasn't as sound as it used to be. At first, Jasper would defend me. Mom raised 2 successful kids, Ravenna. I think she knows what she's doing. But I noticed he started saying it less frequently, and his defenses became weaker over time. The changes didn't happen overnight. They were so gradual, so subtle, that I didn't recognize the pattern until it was too late. First, the Tuesday dinners became every other week because Jasper's been so busy at work. Then they became monthly. Then they disappeared altogether, replaced by text messages asking if I was doing okay and promises to stop by soon that never materialized. The babysitting requests became less frequent too. Where I used to watch the twins 2 or 3 times a month, suddenly Ravenna had found a wonderful new daycare or another mom from the neighborhood who loves having play dates. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor, relieving me of the burden of childcare. I know how tiring it can be for you, Cordelia, she'd say with that bright, fake smile. And at your age, you should be focusing on your own needs, your own interests. What interests exactly? My interests had always been my family. My hobbies had always involved creating things for the people I loved, knitting sweaters for the twins, preserving vegetables from my garden to share, researching family genealogy to pass down stories to the next generation. Grandma, teach me how to make Grandpa's apple butter again, Ravenna would say when my granddaughter wanted to know about the birds in my backyard. She's probably tired. I wasn't tired. I was never too tired for my grandchildren. But slowly, systematically, Ravenna was teaching them that I was fragile, that my attention was a burden rather than a gift, that their natural curiosity and energy might be too much for their aging grandmother to handle. The most heartbreaking part was watching Jasper transform from the son who cherished our weekly talks into a man who seemed increasingly uncomfortable in my presence. Not because he loved me less, but because he was being conditioned to see me differently. Every interaction was filtered through Ravenna's subtle commentary about my limitations, my old-fashioned ways, my inability to keep up with modern parenting standards. What I didn't understand then was that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't the natural evolution of a busy family growing apart. This was strategic. This was deliberate. Ravenna was systematically isolating me from my own family, and she was doing it so skillfully that even I didn't recognize it as manipulation. She was preparing the ground for that Easter Sunday when she would finally say out loud what she'd been implying for 3 years, that I was useless, that I had no value beyond my willingness to provide free childcare and financial support, and that my family would be better off without my outdated influence in their lives. But here's what Ravenna didn't know about the woman she was underestimating. I hadn't spent the past 15 years just grieving my husband and growing older. I'd been growing stronger, smarter, and wealthier in ways that would have shocked her into silence if she'd known the truth. The same woman she dismissed as a burden clipping coupons at the grocery store had been quietly building an investment portfolio that would make her designer lifestyle look like pocket change. The same grandmother she considered too old-fashioned to watch her children had been learning cryptocurrency trading, real estate investment, and wealth management strategies that most people half my age couldn't master. While she was busy erasing me from my family's daily life, I was busy creating a foundation that would soon shift the balance of power in ways she never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, you need to see just how far she was willing to go to make me disappear completely from the lives of the people I loved most. First, you need to understand the depth of her manipulation and the extent of her cruelty. Because that Easter Sunday wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war from a woman who had no idea she was fighting someone who had been quietly preparing for battle for years. The first real warning sign came 6 months after Ravenna moved into that Colonial and Elmwood Heights, though at the time I dismissed it as wedding stress and the natural adjustment period of a new marriage.
It was a crisp October evening when Jasper called, his voice strained in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager dealing with high school heartbreak. "Mom, can we talk? I mean, really talk. Just you and me?" Of course, I said yes. My son needed me, and that's what mothers are for. We arranged to meet at Riverside Diner, a little place we'd gone to countless times over the years when he needed space to think out loud. It was our neutral ground, away from distractions where some of our most important conversations had happened. He arrived looking exhausted, his usually pristine appearance slightly rumpled, like he'd been running his hands through his hair. We ordered coffee and sat in our usual booth by the window, but something felt different. There was a distance in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a careful quality to his words that made me feel like I was talking to a stranger wearing my son's face. "I need to ask you about something," he began, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision. "Ravenna mentioned that you made some comments about our house, about how we're raising the twins." My heart sank. "What kind of comments?" "She said you told her the house was too big, too fancy, and that we were spoiling the children. She said you criticized her parenting choices and suggested that she was being materialistic." I sat back in the vinyl booth, genuinely shocked. "Jasper, I never said any of those things. When did this conversation supposedly happen?" He looked uncomfortable, his jaw tightening. "Last Tuesday, when you came over for dinner, she said you made several pointed remarks about the cost of everything, about how different things were when you were little." Last Tuesday? I remembered that dinner vividly because it had been such a lovely evening. The twins had shown me their new playroom, and I'd complimented Ravenna on how beautifully she had organized everything. I'd asked about the handcrafted dollhouse in the corner, not to criticize its cost, but because I was genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship and wanted to know where she'd found such a talented artisan. "Son, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully. "I remember that evening, and I certainly didn't criticize anything. I was admiring the dollhouse and asking where you'd purchased it because I thought it was beautiful." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't entirely believe me. Not because he thought I was lying, but because the seed of doubt had already been planted. Ravenna had gotten there first with her version of events, and now my truth sounded like damage control.
"Maybe it was just a misinterpretation," he said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Ravenna has been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. The twins are at such a demanding age, and she's trying to do everything perfectly." There it was, the first hint of the narrative that would eventually consume our relationship. Ravenna as the overwhelmed young mother, struggling to maintain standards that her critical mother-in-law constantly questioned. Me as the judgmental elder who couldn't appreciate her daughter-in-law's efforts or adapt to modern ways of living. "Jasper, you know I would never intentionally hurt Ravenna's feelings or undermine her choices as a mother," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "If I said something that came across wrong, I sincerely apologize. That was never my intention." He squeezed my hand, and for a moment, I saw my real son again, the boy who used to tell me everything, who trusted my love unconditionally. "I know, Mom. I know you wouldn't do that on purpose. I want everyone to get along, you know? I want my family to be happy." That phrase, "I want my family to be happy," stuck with me for weeks afterward. Not, "I want our family to be happy," which would have included me, but "my family," as if I existed in some separate category, some outer orbit of relationships that could potentially threaten the harmony of his core unit. The second warning sign came just 2 weeks later, during Harmony's 4th birthday party. I had spent days preparing her gift. A hand-sewn dress with matching doll clothes, something I'd learned to make from my own grandmother decades earlier. It was intricate work, tiny stitches and delicate embroidery, the kind of project that takes hours of love and patience.
When Harmony opened the gift, her face lit up with genuine delight. She held the dress up to herself, spinning around to show everyone, chattering excitedly about how she wanted to wear it immediately. It was exactly the reaction I'd hoped for. A moment of pure connection between grandmother and granddaughter. But Ravenna's response chilled me to the bone. "Oh, Cordelia, that's so thoughtful," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound appreciative while her eyes remained cold. "It's very handmade, isn't it?" The way she said handmade made it sound like a flaw rather than a feature, like I'd given her daughter something substandard, something embarrassingly amateur compared to the sleek, store-bought gifts that surrounded us. "Harmony, sweetheart," Ravenna continued, gently taking the dress from her daughter's hands, "this is the kind of special dress we save for very special occasions, okay? We don't want to ruin it by wearing it too often." I watched my granddaughter's face fall slightly, her excitement dimming as she learned to categorize my gift as something precious but impractical, something to be preserved rather than enjoyed. The message was subtle, but clear. Grandma's gifts were different, old-fashioned, not quite suitable for everyday life. Later that evening, as I was helping to clean up after the party, I overheard Ravenna on the phone with someone, probably her mother or a close friend. "Oh, you should have seen it," she was saying, her voice carrying that tone of barely contained amusement. "Hand-sewn, with all these tiny, crooked stitches. It must have taken her forever, poor thing. I mean, it's sweet in a way, but honestly, who has time for that kind of hobby anymore?" Harmony was polite about it, thank goodness, but you could tell she was more excited about the electronics and the bike. Crooked stitches, poor thing, hobby. I stood frozen in the kitchen, dish towel in my hands, feeling something shift inside my chest. This wasn't miscommunication or wedding stress. This was deliberate diminishment, a systematic effort to reframe my contributions as quaint but irrelevant, as burdens disguised as gifts. The third warning sign came during Thanksgiving, and it was the most devastating of all because it involved Phoenix, my sensitive, thoughtful grandson who had always been especially close to me. I had brought my traditional sweet potato casserole, the recipe that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was Jasper's absolute favorite, something he'd specifically requested every Thanksgiving since he was Phoenix's age. But when I arrived at their house that morning, I discovered that Ravenna had already prepared a sweet potato dish, a modern version with exotic spices and a quinoa hopping that looked like something from a gourmet magazine. "Oh, Cordelia, I didn't realize you were making sweet potatoes too. How funny that we both had the same idea." She hadn't had the same idea. She had deliberately chosen to make the one dish that was traditionally mine, the one contribution that had always been my specialty at family gatherings. And she'd made it modern, sophisticated, better than my old-fashioned version could ever be. "We'll just put both out," Jasper said, trying to keep the peace, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. 2 sweet potato dishes was excessive, and everyone knew it. The comparison was inevitable, and it wasn't going to favor the traditional version made by the old woman who still used her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards.
But the real blow came when 6-year-old Phoenix, my serious, thoughtful grandson who had always been interested in family stories and traditions, looked at both dishes and asked innocently, "Why did you make the same thing as Mommy, Grandma Cordelia? Didn't you know she was already making the good kind?" The good kind. Not the different kind or the fancy kind, but the good kind. My grandson, without meaning to hurt me, had absorbed the message that his mother's version was superior, that my traditional recipe was somehow lacking in comparison to her modern interpretation. Ravenna didn't correct him. She didn't say that both versions were good in their own way, or that families can have multiple traditions, or that Grandma's recipe was special because it connected us to our history. She just smiled and ruffled his hair, letting the casual cruelty of childhood honesty do her work for her. That night, I went home to my little house on Maple Street and sat at my kitchen table staring at the recipe card that had belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, then me. The edges were worn soft from decades of handling, the ink faded but still legible in my grandmother's careful script. For the first time since Garrett died, I felt truly alone. Not just physically alone, which I'd grown accustomed to, but existentially alone, like I was becoming invisible, even to the people who were supposed to love me most. I should have recognized then that this wasn't about sweet potato casseroles or hand-sewn dresses or misunderstood comments. This was about power, territory, and a young woman who saw me as a threat to her complete control over her husband and children. Ravenna wasn't just trying to establish herself as the primary woman in Jasper's life. She was systematically erasing me from my own family's narrative, one small incident at a time. Every tradition I'd maintained, every special relationship I'd built, every way I'd contributed to our family's life was being quietly rewritten as outdated, burdensome, or inadequate. But I didn't understand the scope of her campaign yet. I thought these were isolated incidents, growing pains in our relationship that would resolve themselves with time and patience. I thought if I tried harder, if I was more careful with my words, if I adapted to her preferences and standards, we could find our way to mutual respect and genuine affection. I had no idea that she was already planning the complete destruction of my place in this family, and that everything I was experiencing was just the preliminary groundwork for something much more devastating. I had no idea that my patience and willingness to accommodate her criticism was being interpreted as weakness, and that she was carefully documenting every moment of my retreat as evidence of my declining relevance. Most importantly, I had no idea that while I was losing sleep over hurt feelings and damaged relationships, I should have been preparing for war. What started as subtle undermining evolved into something far more calculated and cruel over the following 18 months. Ravenna's campaign against me shifted into higher gear, and I began to understand that this wasn't about personality clashes or adjustment periods. This was about complete territorial conquest. The escalation began with what I now recognize as systematic gaslighting, though at the time I just thought I was losing my mind. Small things would go missing when I visited their house. My reading glasses, my car keys, the little notebook where I kept reminders about the twins' activities and preferences. Nothing valuable enough to seem like theft, just inconvenient enough to make me appear scattered and forgetful. "Oh, Cordelia, are you feeling all right?" Ravenna would ask with exaggerated concern when I couldn't find my glasses after dinner. "Maybe you left them at home? It's so easy to get confused when we're visiting different places." The implication was always there, that my age was catching up with me, that my memory wasn't as sharp as it used to be, that perhaps I couldn't be trusted to keep track of important things anymore. Jasper would find my glasses later, usually in some obvious location like the kitchen counter, and Ravenna would shake her head sympathetically. "Poor thing probably just set them down without thinking," she'd murmur to him, just loud enough for me to overhear. It happens at that age. But I knew I hadn't left my glasses on the kitchen counter. I had very specific habits about where I placed my belongings, habits developed over decades of living alone and needing to keep track of my possessions. Someone had moved them, and there was only one person with both the opportunity and the motivation to make me look incompetent. The missing items were just the beginning. Ravenna started correcting me in front of the family about things that supposedly happened, conversations we'd allegedly had, promises I'd apparently made or broken. She did it with such confidence, such detailed certainty, that even I began to doubt my own recollections. "Remember last month when you said you'd help me organize the twins' playroom?" she'd ask during Sunday dinner, her voice innocent but her eyes watchful. "I waited all afternoon for you to come over, but you never showed up."
I would search my memory frantically, trying to recall this conversation, this commitment I'd supposedly made. Had I really forgotten something so important? Had I really left her waiting? The uncertainty was maddening, especially when Jasper would look at me with disappointment and say things like, "Mom, if you're not feeling up to helping, just say so. Don't leave Ravenna hanging." The most insidious part was how she used my own words against me, taking innocent comments out of context and reshaping them into evidence of my declining judgment or inappropriate behavior. If I mentioned that the twins seemed tired during one of my visits, she'd later tell Jasper that I'd criticized their bedtime routine. If I complimented Phoenix's independence, she'd claim I'd accused her of being overprotective. "Your mother seems to have a lot of opinions about how we're raising our children," she'd tell my son, always when I wasn't around to defend myself. "I try not to take it personally, but it's getting a bit overwhelming. Maybe she's feeling left out and doesn't know how to express it constructively." Jasper would then approach me with careful, diplomatic language about being supportive rather than critical and respecting Ravenna's choices as a mother. Each conversation left me feeling more confused and isolated, like I was failing some test I didn't even know I was taking. The financial manipulation started around this time too. Though it was so subtle, I almost missed it entirely. During casual conversations, Ravenna would drop hints about their expenses, their financial pressures, the cost of maintaining their lifestyle while raising twins. "The mortgage on this place is absolutely brutal," she'd sigh, while showing me some new addition to their home. "And with the twins needing so many things as they grow, well, we're just trying to stay afloat, you know?" These comments were always followed by meaningful looks, pregnant pauses that invited me to offer assistance. And like the devoted mother and grandmother I was, I often did. A few hundred here for Phoenix's karate lessons, 1,000 there for Hermione's gymnastics equipment, 5,000 when they needed new appliances for the kitchen. "You're so generous, Cordelia," Ravenna would say, accepting my checks with gracious smiles. "The twins are so lucky to have a grandmother who cares this much about their future." But I began to notice that these financial emergencies often coincided with Ravenna's shopping trips, her spa days, her girls' weekends that seemed to require increasingly expensive accommodations. The money I gave for the children's activities somehow never quite covered the actual costs, requiring additional contributions that added up to far more than the original request. When I gently suggested that perhaps they should create a budget to better track these expenses, Ravenna's response was swift and brutal. "Oh, Cordelia, I know you mean well, but financial planning has changed so much since your day," she said with that patronizing smile I'd grown to dread. "Things are much more complex now than they were when you were managing a household. We have investment portfolios, college funds, tax strategies. It's really quite sophisticated." The implication was clear. I was too old, too simple, too out of touch to understand modern financial management. Never mind that I'd been successfully managing money for decades, or that I'd raised 2 children as a widow on a limited income, or that I'd somehow managed to keep my own household running smoothly for 15 years after my husband's death. The worst part was watching how this narrative affected my relationship with the twins. Children are incredibly perceptive, and they began to absorb the subtle messages that their mother was sending about my grandmother's declining capabilities and questionable judgment. Harmony, who had once run to me with scraped knees and exciting news, started hesitating before sharing her thoughts, looking to her mother for approval before speaking freely. When I'd ask her about her day at school or her friends, she'd give short, careful answers instead of the elaborate stories she used to tell. Phoenix, my serious little grandson, who had always been fascinated by my stories about the family's history, began responding to my tales with polite but distant attention. When I'd mention his great-aunt Garrett or tell him about the old days, he'd nod respectfully but without the engaged curiosity that had once made our conversations so special. "Your mother seems to have a lot of opinions about how we're raising our children," she'd tell my son, always when I wasn't around to defend myself. "I try not to take it personally, but it's getting a bit overwhelming. Maybe she's feeling left out and doesn't know how to express it constructively." The social isolation became more systematic around this time, too. Family gatherings that had once been planned around my availability suddenly happened when I had conflicts. Birthday parties were scheduled for weekends when I had already committed to other activities. Then I'd be gently chided for not making the family a priority. "We really missed you at Phoenix's soccer game last Saturday. The other grandparents were all there cheering him on." Never mind that I'd never been told about the soccer game, or that I'd spent that Saturday volunteering at the food bank as I had every month for the past 5 years. Somehow, my absence became evidence of my declining interest in my grandchildren rather than a result of poor communication. When I'd try to address these scheduling conflicts directly, Ravenna would look genuinely surprised and concerned. "Oh my goodness, I was sure I told you about that," she'd say, her eyes wide with apparent confusion. "I specifically remember mentioning it because I know how much you love watching Phoenix play. Are you sure you didn't just forget?" There it was again. The suggestion that my memory was failing, that I was becoming unreliable, that perhaps I couldn't be trusted to keep track of important family events anymore. Each incident built on the previous ones, creating a narrative of decline that became more difficult to refute with every passing month. The most devastating escalation came during the twins' 6th birthday party, an elaborate affair that Ravenna had been planning for months. She'd rented the community center, hired professional entertainers, and invited what seemed like half of Elmwood Heights to celebrate her children. I arrived with carefully chosen gifts, art supplies for Harmony, who loved to draw, and a beginner's astronomy kit for Phoenix, who had recently developed an interest in stars. I had spent considerable time selecting items that would nurture their individual interests while also providing educational value. But when the twins opened their presents, Ravenna's reaction was swift and humiliating. "Oh my goodness, I was sure I told you about that," she said, loud enough for nearby parents to hear. "These are so thoughtful, but I'm worried they might be a little advanced for the children's current development level." She held up the astronomy kit, examining it with exaggerated concern. "This looks quite complicated. Are you sure it's age-appropriate?" Several other parents had turned to watch this interaction, and I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment. The kit was clearly labeled for ages 6 and up, and Phoenix was an exceptionally bright child who had already shown interest in science and nature. "The package says it's suitable for their age," I said quietly, trying to maintain my dignity while feeling increasingly defensive. "Oh, I know what the package says, but you know how these manufacturers exaggerate. They just want to sell products. As their mother, I have to be more discerning about what's truly appropriate for my children's emotional and intellectual development." The other parents nodded knowingly, sharing those looks that parents exchange when they witness someone else's child-rearing mistake. I was being publicly corrected, publicly humiliated, publicly categorized as the well-meaning but clueless grandmother who doesn't understand modern children's needs. But what devastated me most wasn't the public embarrassment. It was watching my grandchildren learn to doubt their own excitement about my gifts, to second-guess their natural enthusiasm because their mother had labeled it inappropriate. The lesson they absorbed wasn't about age-appropriate toys. It was about not trusting their grandmother's judgment or caring. That night, I sat in my car in their driveway for 20 minutes after the party ended, watching through the windows as Ravenna moved through her perfect house, straightening decorations and probably already planning her next social media posts about the successful celebration. I realized that I was watching my family from the outside now, literally and figuratively. I had become a visitor in the lives of my people I loved most, someone whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, whose contributions were scrutinized rather than appreciated. But what Ravenna didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while she had been busy humiliating me in public and isolating me from my family, I had been quietly building something that would soon shift the balance of power in ways she never could have imagined. The woman she was systematically destroying had been preparing for exactly this kind of battle for longer than she realized. The moment everything moved from private manipulation to public spectacle happened on a snowy February evening during what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner at Jasper's house. It was meant to be intimate, just the 4 of them plus me, celebrating Phoenix's acceptance into the gifted program at school. But Ravenna had other plans. I should have known something was brewing when she insisted on setting the dining room table with her finest china, the Waterford crystal glasses, and cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles.
This wasn't the casual Sunday dinner setup we'd grown accustomed to. This was staging for something much more significant. "I thought we'd make tonight extra special," she said when I commented on the elaborate presentation. "Phoenix's achievement deserves proper recognition, don't you think?" But as the evening progressed, it became clear that Phoenix's academic success was just the backdrop for a much larger performance. Ravenna had invited her parents, Harold and Beatrice Thornfield, to join us at the last minute. Though their perfectly coordinated outfits and Harold's professional-grade camera suggested this was anything but spontaneous. The Thornfields had never been particularly warm toward me, viewing me as Jasper's unfortunate baggage from his previous life rather than his mother. Harold was a retired bank president who spoke in financial terminology even during casual conversation, and Beatrice was a former debutante who collected charity board positions like some people collect stamps. They represented everything I wasn't: wealthy, socially connected, and utterly convinced of their own superiority.
"Cordelia," Beatrice said when she arrived, air-kissing near my cheek without actually making contact. "You look comfortable." I was wearing my best sweater, the deep blue cashmere one Ludia had given me for Christmas 2 years earlier, but compared to Beatrice's designer ensemble, I might as well have been wearing burlap. The comparison was intentional, calculated to make me feel underdressed and out of place in my own son's home. Dinner conversation flowed around topics I couldn't meaningfully contribute to: country club politics, investment strategies, exotic vacation destinations, and social events in circles where I'd never be welcome. When I tried to engage by asking about Phoenix's school project or Harmony's recent art class, the responses were brief and polite before the conversation inevitably returned to subjects that excluded me. "We're thinking of taking the twins to Aspen for spring break," Ravenna announced, her voice bright with excitement. "The Hendersons have that lovely chalet, and they've offered to let us use it for a week." "How wonderful!" Beatrice enthused. "The mountain air will be so good for the children, much better than other environments they might be exposed to." Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward me when she said other environments, and I understood that she was referring to my modest neighborhood, my small house with its overgrown garden and peeling paint. In her mind, my influence was something the children needed protection from, not exposure to. But the real ambush came during dessert, when Harold cleared his throat in that pompous way men of his generation used to signal important announcements. "Jasper, Ravenna has shared some concerns with us about your mother's situation," he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd probably used in countless board meetings. "We think it might be time to have an honest family discussion about everyone's long-term needs." My stomach dropped. I looked at Jasper, hoping to see confusion or surprise on his face, but instead I saw resignation. This conversation had been planned, rehearsed, coordinated without my knowledge. I was about to be ambushed by my own family. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Ravenna leaned forward, her expression perfectly crafted to convey loving worry. "We're just concerned about you living alone in that big house, Cordelia. The maintenance, the isolation, the incidents we've noticed." Incidents? The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't see but could definitely smell. "What incidents?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Harold consulted a small notebook he'd pulled from his jacket pocket, as if he were presenting evidence in a courtroom. "According to Ravenna's observations, you've been increasingly forgetful over the past year, misplacing items, missing important family events, struggling to keep track of conversations and commitments." Each word felt like a small blade being inserted between my ribs. They had been documenting my supposed decline, building a case against my competency without my knowledge. Every moment of confusion Ravenna had orchestrated, every item she had hidden, every event she had deliberately failed to tell me about was being presented as evidence of my failing mental capacity. There was also the incident with the twins' bedtime story, Beatrice added helpfully. Ravenna mentioned you told them some rather inappropriate tales about family members who had passed away, frightening stories that gave Phoenix nightmares. I stared at her in shock. The inappropriate tale she was referring to was a sweet story about their great-grandfather Garrett's hobby of woodworking, how he made toys for Jasper and Lydia when they were small. Phoenix had asked about the rocking horse in their playroom, and I had told him about his great-grandfather's gentle hands creating something beautiful for children he loved. There had been nothing frightening about it, nothing inappropriate. But somehow, in Ravenna's retelling, my cherished family story had become evidence of poor judgment, of an elderly woman who couldn't distinguish between suitable and unsuitable content for young children. I never told the children any frightening stories, I said, looking directly at Jasper. You know I would never do that. But I could see in his eyes that he was no longer sure what I would or wouldn't do. The campaign of doubt had been so thorough, so systematic, that even my own son was questioning his fundamental knowledge of who I was as a person. Mom, he said gently, using the same tone people use with confused patients in nursing homes. Maybe you don't remember it the way they do. Sometimes when we're getting older, our perception of events can be different from other people's. The betrayal in that sentence was staggering. My own son, the child I raised from birth, was suggesting that my version of reality was unreliable, that my memory and judgment couldn't be trusted over the word of people who had known our family for less than 5 years. The point is, Harold continued, consulting his notebook again, we think it would be beneficial for everyone if you considered moving into a more supportive environment. Somewhere with staff who can help with daily tasks, social activities with people your own age, and professional oversight to ensure your safety and well-being. A nursing home. They were suggesting I move into a nursing home, not because I was ill, not because I couldn't care for myself, but because my existence in my own home had become inconvenient for Ravenna's vision of her perfect family life. I'm 67 years old, I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. I live independently. I manage my own affairs. I volunteer in the community. I don't need professional oversight. Of course you don't think you need help, Beatrice said with that patronizing smile I'd seen on Ravenna's face so many times. That's one of the early signs, isn't it? Lack of insight into one's own limitations. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the soft sound of my own breathing as I tried to process what was happening. They had turned my presence at this dinner into an intervention, my celebration of my grandson's achievement into an evaluation of my mental competency. But the worst part was the twins, sitting at the children's table nearby, absorbing every word of this conversation. They were learning that adults could gang up on someone they supposedly loved, that families could turn against their own members, that being old and alone made you vulnerable to this kind of systematic cruelty. Harmony was staring at her dessert plate, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. Phoenix kept glancing between his parents and me, his young face troubled by the undercurrents he could sense but not fully understand. Grandma Cordelia, are you sick? Phoenix said quietly, his serious dark eyes fixed on my face. The question broke my heart because it was asked with genuine worry, innocent concern that had been deliberately cultivated by the adults in his life. He was learning to see me as fragile, problematic, someone who needed to be managed rather than simply loved. No, sweetheart, I said, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not sick. Sometimes adults just disagree about things. But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in his expression, the confusion about whom to believe. The adults he trusted most were all saying one thing, and I was saying another. In his 6-year-old logic, the majority must be right. The important thing, Harold said, returning to his notebook like a prosecutor reading charges, is that we all want what's best for Cordelia, and sometimes what's best for someone isn't what they think they want. That sentence crystallized everything for me. This wasn't about my well-being or my safety or my happiness. This was about what was convenient for them.
what would make their lives easier, what would remove the last obstacle between Ravenna and complete control over her family narrative. They wanted me erased not because I was failing, but because I was succeeding in ways that threatened her. They wanted me gone not because I was becoming a burden, but because I represented a different set of values, a different way of loving and being loved that didn't fit into her carefully constructed world. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that while they were busy planning my exile to a nursing home, I had been quietly building an empire that would soon make their comfortable assumptions about my powerlessness look like the dangerous miscalculations they truly were. The woman they were trying to institutionalize had resources they couldn't even comprehend, and the patience to use those resources in ways that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this family. That night marked the end of my willingness to be a victim of their manipulation. That night marked the beginning of their education in exactly how dangerous it can be to underestimate someone just because she clips coupons and drives an old car. The breaking point arrived on that Easter Sunday, but not in the way anyone expected, least of all me. What should have been a celebration of renewal and family togetherness became the moment when years of calculated cruelty finally exploded into something so vicious, so publicly humiliating, that there could be no more pretending this was about misunderstandings or generational differences. I had arrived at their house that morning cautiously optimistic, carrying my traditional lemon meringue pie and wearing the new lavender dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Despite everything that had happened over the past 3 years, some stubborn part of me still hoped we could find our way back to being a real family. Easter had always been about forgiveness and second chances, hadn't it? The house looked magnificent, as always. Ravenna had outserved herself with the decorations. Fresh tulips and daffodils arranged in crystal vases, pastel ribbons draped elegantly throughout the rooms, and a dining table that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Everything was perfect, pristine, and somehow cold despite the warm spring sunshine streaming through the windows.
The extended family had gathered in force. Lydia and her husband Marcus, with their daughter Chloe, my brother-in-law Frederick, and several of Ravenna's relatives I'd met only briefly at the wedding years ago. The children were dressed like little angels in their Easter finery, running around the backyard hunting for eggs, while the adults mingled with mimosas and polite conversation. For the first hour, everything seemed almost normal. Ravenna was gracious and charming, complimenting my pie and thanking me for the small Easter gifts I'd brought for the twins. Jasper seemed relaxed, laughing with his Uncle Frederick about something that had happened at work. Even Harold and Beatrice were present, but mercifully focused on other conversations. I began to let my guard down, to hope that perhaps the intervention dinner in February had cleared the air somehow, that maybe we could move forward with better understanding and mutual respect. How naive I was to think that Ravenna's cruelty had limits, that there were lines she wouldn't cross even in her relentless campaign to erase me from this family. The first sign of trouble came during the egg hunt. I was sitting on the patio, watching Harmony and Phoenix search through the flower beds, when Phoenix ran up to me with a particularly beautiful painted egg he'd found. "Look, Grandma Cordelia," he said breathlessly, his face flushed with excitement. "This one has stars on it, just like the ones you taught me about." I had spent an evening with him months earlier, showing him constellations through the old telescope I'd found in Garrett's things. It had been one of our last truly unguarded moments together, just grandfather and grandson sharing wonder at the night sky. That he remembered, that he connected this small decoration to our time together, filled my heart with unexpected joy. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, admiring the delicate silver stars painted against a deep blue background. "Someone put a lot of love into making that." But before Phoenix could respond, Ravenna appeared beside us like a shadow falling across the sun. "Phoenix, honey, put that back where you found it," she said, her voice sweet but firm. "Those are the special eggs for the older children. The ones your age are over by the roses. But I found it fair and square, Phoenix protested, clutching the egg protectively. And Grandma Cordelia likes the stars. I know you found it, sweetheart, but rules are rules. We have to be fair to everyone, don't we? I watched this interaction with growing unease. There had been no mention of age-specific eggs, no rules announced to the children about which areas were appropriate for which age groups. This was improvisation, a power play disguised as parenting. "It's fine, Phoenix," I said gently, trying to defuse the situation. "There are lots of other beautiful eggs to find." But Ravenna wasn't finished. "Actually, Cordelia, I think it's better if you let me handle the parenting decisions. Don't you? You're not always aware of the systems we have in place for managing the children's expectations and behavior." The casual dismissal stung, but it was delivered in front of my grandson, who was now looking between his mother and me with confusion and disappointment. He was learning in real time that his grandmother's opinion carried no weight in his mother's world, that whatever connection we shared could be severed at his mother's whim. Phoenix reluctantly handed over the egg and trudged away toward the rose bushes, his earlier enthusiasm dimmed. I watched him go, feeling something hardened in my chest that was soft and hopeful just moments before. The second incident happened during dinner when the conversation turned to summer plans. Various family members were discussing vacations, camps for the children, and weekend activities. When there was a lull in the conversation, I mentioned that I'd been thinking about taking the twins to the Natural History Museum in the city, something we'd talked about months earlier. "Oh, Cordelia," Ravenna said with that laugh that always sounded like glass breaking, "I don't think that's such a good idea anymore. The museum is so crowded, so overstimulating for children their age. And with all those stairs and crowds, well, it might be more than you could handle safely." She said it with such concern, such apparent thoughtfulness, that anyone listening would think she was protecting both me and the children from a potentially dangerous situation. I have taken children to museums before. I managed to raise 2 of them successfully. Of course you did, and you did a wonderful job. But things are different now. Security concerns, accessibility issues, the sheer number of people. It's just not the same world you navigated when Jasper and Lydia were small. Again, the dismissal was wrapped in apparent concern, delivered in a tone that suggested she was being reasonable, while I was being stubborn and unrealistic. And again, it was happening in front of an audience that included my grandchildren, who were absorbing the lesson that Grandma Cordelia couldn't be trusted to take them places anymore. But the true breaking point came after dinner, during what should have been a peaceful moment of family relaxation. The adults were lingering over coffee and dessert, while the children played in the living room nearby. I was sitting quietly, trying to process the day's accumulated slights, when Ravenna made an announcement that would change everything. "I have some exciting news to share," she said, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for her social media posts. "Jasper and I have been discussing our summer plans, and we've decided to take the twins to Europe for 6 weeks. A real cultural education experience. London, Paris, Rome, all the places they should see while they're young enough to really absorb it." The family responded with appropriate enthusiasm, asking about itineraries and accommodations. It sounded wonderful, exactly the kind of experience that would broaden the twins' horizons and create lasting memories. Then Ravenna delivered the blow I should have seen coming. "Of course, this means we'll need some help with costs," she continued, her eyes fixed on me with laser precision. "Extended international travel with children is incredibly expensive, especially if you want to do it right. We were hoping some of our family members might want to contribute to this educational opportunity." The room fell silent.
everyone understood what was being asked and whom it was being asked of. Despite my modest appearance, my careful spending habits, my small house and old car, somehow it had become family knowledge that I was expected to fund their lifestyle choices. "How much are we talking about?" asked Frederick, though his tone suggested he was asking out of curiosity rather than willingness to contribute. "Well, to do it properly, nice hotels, educational tours, cultural experiences, we'd need about $25,000 beyond what we can manage ourselves," Ravenna said, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. $25,000. For a vacation. For a family that lived in a $500,000 house and spent more on Ravenna's monthly shopping trips than I spent on food in 6 months. "That's quite a lot," Lydia said carefully, glancing at me with obvious concern. "It is," Ravenna agreed. "But think about the memories we'd be creating, the educational value, the cultural exposure. Really, can you put a price on that kind of experience for the children?" She was framing it as if anyone who hesitated to contribute was somehow failing the twins, prioritizing money over their development and happiness. It was masterful manipulation, and I recognized it even as I felt its pull. But what happened next destroyed any remaining patience I had for her games. "Of course, we understand that not everyone is in a position to help," she continued, her eyes shifting meaningfully toward me. "Some people are on fixed incomes, limited resources. Some people have to choose between their own comfort and their family's dreams." The implication was clear. I was selfish, stingy, prioritizing my own modest needs over my grandchildren's once-in-a-lifetime educational opportunity. She was painting me as the grandmother who could help but chose not to, who valued her financial security more than her family's happiness. "Cordelia," she said, addressing me directly now, "we know this is a lot to ask. We know that someone in your situation might not be able to contribute much. Even a small amount would be meaningful. Every little bit helps, and it would show the twins that their grandmother believes in investing in their future." The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. She was simultaneously asking for my money and insulting my ability to provide it, positioning herself as graciously accepting whatever scraps I might be able to offer from my presumably limited resources. But the breaking point wasn't the manipulation or the financial pressure or even the public humiliation of being painted as a stingy person in front of my entire family. The breaking point came when 6-year-old Harmony looked up from her coloring book and asked, in the innocent way that children ask devastating questions, "Grandma Cordelia, why don't you want us to learn about other countries? Don't you want us to be smart?" The room went completely silent. My granddaughter, my sweet, innocent granddaughter, had absorbed the message that my failure to immediately offer $25,000 meant I didn't care about her education or her future. She had learned to see my financial boundaries as a rejection of her rather than a reasonable response to an outrageous demand. That was the moment when something inside me shattered completely. Not my heart. That had been breaking slowly for 3 years. What shattered was my willingness to pretend this was anything other than financial exploitation wrapped in emotional manipulation. "Harmony, sweetheart," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want you and Phoenix to learn about everything, but wanting something and being able to pay for it aren't the same thing." "But Mommy says you have money saved up," she chimed in, looking confused. "She says you just don't like spending it on fun things." And there it was.
Ravenna had been poisoning my grandchildren against me, not just through isolation and undermining, but by painting me as a miser who hoarded money while denying them opportunities. She had turned my careful financial management into evidence of my selfishness, my failure to contribute to their expensive lifestyle, into proof that I didn't love them enough. That's when Ravenna delivered the line that ended everything.
"Well, Cordelia," she said with that smile that had always made my skin crawl, "I suppose we all have different priorities. Some people invest in experiences and memories for the people they love. Others—" She shrugged delicately, letting the sentence hang in the air like a noose. "Others what?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Others just exist, don't they? Taking up space, using resources, but not really contributing anything meaningful to the world around them. It's sad, really, when someone becomes so focused on their own security that they forget what it means to be generous, to be useful to their family." Useful. There was that word again, the one that had been haunting me for months. "You think I'm useless," I said. Not a question, but a statement. Ravenna's smile widened, and I saw something in her eyes that was pure malice, barely concealed triumph at finally being able to say what she'd been thinking for years. "I think you're exactly as useful as you choose to be, Cordelia, and lately that seems to be not very much at all." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the room at my family, my son, my daughter, my brother-in-law, my grandchildren, waiting for someone to defend me, to say that was too far, to acknowledge that I had contributed plenty to this family over the years. Nobody spoke. That's when I realized that the woman who had been quietly building a financial empire for 15 years was about to teach everyone in that room exactly how useful she really was. The drive home from that Easter dinner passed in a strange, crystalline clarity I hadn't felt in years. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing even and controlled. The humiliation should have left me shaking with rage or dissolving into tears, but instead I felt something I'd almost forgotten: absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. For 3 years, I had been reacting to Ravenna's attacks, defending myself against accusations I didn't understand, trying to maintain relationships that were being systematically poisoned against me. I had been playing defense in a game where I didn't even know the rules, let alone the stakes. That ended today. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Maple Street, I had made the decision that would change everything. Not a decision born from anger or hurt feelings, though both were certainly present, but from the kind of cold, calculating resolve that comes when you finally understand the true nature of the battle you've been fighting. I walked into my modest little house, the one Ravenna and her family saw as evidence of my limited means and declining circumstances, and went straight to my bedroom closet. Behind the winter coats and old photo boxes, in a fireproof safe I'd installed years earlier, were documents that would have stopped their condescending smiles in an instant if they'd known they existed. Investment portfolios with balances that had grown from Garrett's modest life insurance policy into something substantial through 15 years of careful, disciplined management. Real estate deeds for properties in 3 different states, purchased quietly over the years as rental investments. Bank statements for accounts they'd never heard of, opened under my maiden name and funded through income streams they couldn't have imagined. While Ravenna had been busy painting me as a poor, useless widow living on Social Security, I had been building wealth in ways that would have made Harold Thornfield's banking expertise look amateur by comparison. Cryptocurrency investments I started in 2018 when everyone said I was too old to understand technology. A portfolio of dividend stocks that generated more monthly income than most people's salaries. 3 rental properties that had been quietly appreciating in value while providing steady cash flow. The woman they had just called useless was worth $2.3 million. But more importantly, the woman they had just humiliated in front of her grandchildren had detailed financial records of every
loan she had made to their family over the past 5 years. The $50,000 for their house down payment, never repaid, the $15,000 for Jasper's car when his credit was insufficient for the loan he wanted, thousands more for the twins' activities, school expenses, home improvements, and countless other emergencies that had somehow never resulted in any meaningful attempt at repayment. I had been funding their lifestyle while they painted me as stingy. I had been subsidizing their comfort while they criticized my modest living arrangements. I had been enabling their financial irresponsibility while they questioned my competence and usefulness. That stopped now. I picked up my phone and called Marina Blackstone, the estate planning attorney I'd been working with for the past 2 years. Marina was sharp, discreet, and had no patience for family drama that interfered with proper financial planning. "Cordelia?" she answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the kind of respect I hadn't heard from my own family in years. "How was your Easter?" "Educational," I said simply. "Marina, I need to make some changes to my estate plan, immediately." "Of course. What kind of changes are we talking about?" "Complete revision, new beneficiaries, new trusts, new powers of attorney, everything." There was a pause on the line. Marina had seen enough family dysfunction in her practice to recognize the tone of someone who had reached their breaking point. "Would you like to come in tomorrow morning? We can review everything and discuss your options."
Yes, and Marina, I also need to discuss some outstanding loans that need to be called in. Family members who have been unclear about their repayment obligations. I understand. We'll address all of it. 10 a.m. work for you? After hanging up with Marina, I made my second call to David Chen, the accountant who had been managing my more complex investments for the past decade. David was one of the few people who understood the full scope of my financial position, and like Marina, he had always treated me with the professional respect my family seemed incapable of offering. "David, I need to liquidate some positions and restructure some accounts," I told him. "I'm going to be making some significant changes in how I handle family financial arrangements." "Are we talking about major moves here, Cordelia?" "We're talking about complete independence. No more subsidizing other people's poor financial decisions. No more being taken for granted." David had met Jasper and Ravenna at a few social events over the years, and I could hear the understanding in his voice when he said, "I'll have some options ready for you by tomorrow afternoon. Cash positions, trust restructuring, whatever you need." My third call was to Rebecca Winters, the private investigator I'd consulted 6 months earlier when I first began to suspect that my family's treatment of me was more coordinated than coincidental. "Rebecca, it's Cordelia Sullivan. I think it's time to move forward with that deeper investigation we discussed." "The family financial analysis? I can have preliminary findings within a week." "Make it 3 days. I have a feeling we're going to need that information sooner than later." By the time I finished making my calls, the sun was setting over my small garden, casting long shadows across the vegetable plots that Harmony and Phoenix used to help me tend. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family saw this modest house as evidence of my limitations, it sat on property that had appreciated considerably over the years and was now worth nearly 4 times what I'd paid for it. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that, while they had been busy underestimating me, I had been preparing for exactly this moment. Every slight, every dismissal, every condescending comment had been noted and filed away, not out of vindictiveness, but out of the practical understanding that people who disrespect you financially will eventually try to exploit you financially. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists. Not emotional lists driven by hurt feelings, but strategic plans based on facts, figures, and legal realities that would soon become impossible for my family to ignore. The first list was titled Outstanding Loans and included every dollar I had lent to Jasper and Ravenna over the past 5 years, with dates, amounts, and the specific purposes they had claimed to need the money for.
The total came to $127,000, not including interest that would have accrued if these had been formal loans rather than family gifts disguised as temporary assistance. My second list was current financial support and detailed every ongoing expense I had been covering without their explicit acknowledgement. The twins' music lessons, Jasper's country club membership, the premium health insurance supplements I had been paying for that allowed them to maintain their healthcare standards on his salary alone. Monthly contributions that totaled more than many people's mortgage payments. The third list was the most important. Assets and accounts unknown to family. This was my insurance policy, my guarantee of independence, my proof that the woman they had just dismissed as useless had been building security and wealth while they had been focusing on spending and consuming. As I worked through these lists, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of taking control, of moving from defense to offense, of transforming from victim to strategist. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of educating my family about the true nature of usefulness, about the difference between being overlooked and being underestimated, about the costs of taking someone's generosity for granted. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet pride in what I had accomplished during the years when they thought I was just existing. While they had been focusing on appearances and social status, I had been building real wealth. While they had been spending money they didn't have on experiences they couldn't afford, I had been investing in assets that would provide security for decades to come. While they had been dismissing me as a burden, I had become the kind of financially independent woman who could choose her own terms for every relationship in her life. The irony was almost perfect. By trying to make me feel powerless, they had given me the motivation to claim more power than they could have imagined. By attempting to isolate me from the family, they had forced me to build resources and relationships outside their influence. By calling me useless, they had challenged me to demonstrate exactly how useful I could be, and how costly their assumption of my usefulness had been for them. Tomorrow would begin their education in the difference between those two things, and I intended to be a very thorough teacher.
The investigation phase began the next morning with the kind of methodical precision I'd learned from 15 years of successful investing. If you want to understand a market before you make your move, you gather data. If you want to dismantle someone's carefully constructed facade, you do the same thing. My first stop was Marina Blackstone's law office in downtown Millfield Creek, a sleek building that reflected the success of someone who understood how money really worked. Marina greeted me with the professional warmth I'd grown to appreciate. No condescension, no assumptions about my capabilities based on my age or appearance. "Cordelia, I've reviewed your current estate plan," she said, settling behind her mahogany desk with a thick file folder. "Before we discuss changes, I want to make sure I understand what's driving this decision. Are we talking about family dynamics, or have there been specific incidents that concern you?" I handed her a typed summary I'd prepared the night before, outlining 3 years of systematic financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and yesterday's public humiliation. Marina read it with the kind of focused attention that expensive legal advice commands, occasionally making notes in the margins. "This is quite comprehensive," she said when she finished reading. "And unfortunately, it's a pattern I've seen before. Adult children who view elderly parents as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected. What are my options?" She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching organizational charts. "Legally, you have several avenues. First, these loans. They were documented, I assume?" "Every one. Bank transfers, emails confirming the purposes, text messages about repayment schedules that were never followed." "Excellent. We can formalize those as demand notes immediately, legally binding documents that require full repayment within 30 days of notification." She continued drawing connecting lines between different legal entities. "Second, we can restructure your estate to remove them as beneficiaries entirely, or create conditional inheritance that depends on specific behavioral changes." "What kind of conditions?"
Public apology, supervised visitation with grandchildren, mandatory family counseling, financial restitution, whatever you feel is appropriate given the harm that's been done. The idea of Ravenna being forced to apologize publicly for calling me useless had a certain poetic appeal, but I was thinking bigger than personal satisfaction. What about creating consequences that actually mattered to them financially? Marina's smile was sharp and professional. Now we're talking about serious wealth management. You could establish trusts that benefit the grandchildren directly, bypassing the parents entirely. College funds, medical care, housing assistance, all controlled by trustees you select with very specific guidelines about how the money can be used. She pulled out another document from my file. Based on your asset portfolio, you could fund substantial trusts for both twins without significantly impacting your own security. The parents would have no access to these funds, no control over how they're distributed. What would that accomplish? It ensures the children's long-term welfare while removing your family's ability to use them as leverage for financial manipulation. Hard to claim you don't care about the grandchildren's education when you've set up million-dollar education trusts in their names. The irony was delicious. While Ravenna had been pressuring me for $25,000 for a European vacation, I could establish funds that would pay for the twins' entire education through graduate school if they chose to pursue it. There's one more thing, Marina said, consulting her notes again. Given the pattern of financial exploitation you've described, we should consider whether there are grounds for elder abuse charges. I blinked. Elder abuse? Financial exploitation of elderly family members is a serious crime in this state. Systematic emotional manipulation combined with financial pressure could qualify, especially if we can document that they were deliberately misrepresenting your financial capacity to pressure you into larger contributions. The thought of Ravenna facing criminal charges for elder abuse was satisfying, but I had bigger plans. Let's keep that as an option, but I want to try some other approaches first. After leaving Marina's office, I drove directly to David Chen's accounting firm. David had spent the morning preparing a comprehensive analysis of my financial position, and the numbers were even better than I'd realized. Your cryptocurrency investments alone have generated returns that most professional fund managers would envy, he said, sliding a portfolio summary across his desk. The 3 rental properties are producing steady cash flow, and their appreciation has been remarkable. What kind of liquid assets are we talking about if I need to make some strategic moves? David consulted his computer screen. Without touching your retirement accounts or primary residence, you have approximately $800,000 in assets that could be liquidated within a week. Your monthly investment income alone is more than most people's annual salary. And if I wanted to call in those family loans immediately, the $127,000 in documented loans, legally collectible, with interest if you choose to pursue it, at current market rates, they'd owe you closer to $150,000. We spent an hour discussing strategies for restructuring my accounts to maximize both independence and impact. David suggested moving some assets into accounts that would be more visible to anyone conducting financial background checks, while keeping others in entities that would remain completely private. The goal is to control the narrative. If they tried to portray you as limited financially, you want documentation readily available to contradict that story.
My third stop was Rebecca Winter's private investigation office, where the preliminary findings about Ravenna's background were more revealing than I'd anticipated. Your daughter-in-law has an interesting financial history, Rebecca said, spreading documents across her conference table. 3 different credit cards maxed out and paid off by family members in the past 5 years. A pattern of expensive purchases followed immediately by financial crises that required intervention. She pointed to a timeline she'd created. Look at this pattern. Every major family event or celebration coincides with a financial emergency that somehow gets resolved through family assistance. You're saying she creates financial crises deliberately?
I'm saying she's very good at timing her needs to coincide with emotional leverage points. The twins' birthdays, holidays, family celebrations, all occasions when family members feel most pressured to be generous and least likely to ask hard questions about repayment. Rebecca pulled out another folder. But here's the interesting part. Her personal spending patterns don't match someone experiencing genuine financial hardship. Luxury spa treatments, designer clothing purchases, expensive restaurants, all charged to credit cards that get mysteriously paid off by family assistants. What about their house, their lifestyle? Heavily leveraged. The mortgage is larger than the property value, and they have significant consumer debt that isn't reflected in their public financial profile. Your son's salary covers basic living expenses, but everything that makes their lifestyle appear successful is being subsidized by external sources. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. In other words, without your financial contributions, they would be facing serious financial consequences within months. The picture that emerged from Rebecca's investigation was of a family living completely beyond their means, using emotional manipulation and my love for my grandchildren to fund a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. Every time I'd written a check to help with the twins' activities or contribute to their emergencies, I had been enabling financial irresponsibility that would eventually harm the very children I was trying to help. But the most damaging revelation came when Rebecca showed me Ravenna's social media history. She's been documenting your family interactions online, Rebecca said, pulling up screenshots from various platforms. Look at these posts from the past year. I stared at images of family gatherings where I'd been cropped out of photos, captions that referred to difficult family dynamics and generational challenges, subtle implications that dealing with elderly relatives required extraordinary patience and understanding. She's been building a public narrative that portrays her as the long-suffering daughter-in-law managing a difficult situation with grace and maturity. Classic manipulation technique. Control the story before anyone questions your behavior. But Rebecca had also found something else. Posts about luxury purchases, exotic vacations, expensive experiences, all dated immediately after I'd made significant financial contributions to their family. She's been using your money to fund a social media lifestyle while simultaneously portraying you as the family burden. It's sophisticated gaslighting combined with financial fraud. By the end of that day, I had assembled a complete picture of what had been happening to me for the past 3 years. This wasn't about personality conflicts or generational differences. This was systematic financial and emotional exploitation by people who had calculated that my love for my grandchildren made me vulnerable to manipulation. They had been wrong about my financial limitations, wrong about my emotional resilience, and most importantly, wrong about my willingness to accept their treatment indefinitely. But what they were about to discover was that the woman they had dismissed as useless had spent those 3 years not just building wealth, but building the knowledge and relationships necessary to use that wealth strategically. The investigation phase was complete. Now came the part they would remember for the rest of their lives, the execution. The execution began on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after that disastrous Easter dinner, and it started with something Ravenna never could have anticipated: silence. For the first time in 5 years, my usual Monday call to check on the twins didn't happen. The weekly text message asking about their school activities and upcoming events went unsent. The habitual inquiry about whether they needed anything for their various lessons and sports remained unasked. By Tuesday afternoon, Jasper called. "Mom, is everything okay? Ravenna said you hadn't been in touch about Phoenix's soccer tournament this weekend." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just taking some time to reassess my priorities." There was a pause. "Reassess your priorities?" "Well, as Ravenna pointed out on Easter, I need to think about how I can be more useful to the people I care about. I'm taking her advice very seriously. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, if this is about what happened at dinner, it's not about what happened, Jasper. It's about what's going to happen. I'll talk to you soon. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Marina Blackstone. It's time, I said simply. File everything we discussed. Within hours, legal documents began arriving at Jasper and Ravenna's pristine colonial. The first was a formal demand letter for repayment of all outstanding loans totaling $127,000 plus interest with a 30-day deadline for full payment. The second was notification that all ongoing financial support, the twins' music lessons, Jasper's club membership, the health insurance supplements, would be discontinued immediately.
The third document was the most devastating. A comprehensive financial disclosure prepared by David Chen detailing my actual net worth and income streams. Every assumption they had made about my limited means, every condescending comment about my financial situation, every manipulation based on their belief that I was dependent on Social Security, all of it was demolished in 12 pages of cold, hard numbers. Ravenna called within an hour of the courier's delivery. "Cordelia, what is this?" Her voice had lost its usual honeyed tone, replaced by something sharp and panicked. "These legal papers? This financial document? I don't understand." "It's very simple, Ravenna. You said I wasn't being useful to the family anymore, so I'm stopping all the ways I was apparently being useful without anyone noticing." "But this says you want us to pay back over $100,000? These were gifts, family support, not loans." "Actually, if you check your text messages and emails from the past 5 years, you'll find that each transfer was described as temporary assistance, with discussions about repayment schedules that you simply ignored. Marina has all of the documentation." I could hear papers rustling in the background, probably Jasper reading over her shoulder. "And this financial report," Ravenna continued, her voice climbing toward hysteria, "this says you're worth— this can't be right." $2.3 million, yes. Apparently, I've been much more successful at managing money than you assumed. Funny how someone you considered useless could accumulate that kind of wealth while you were struggling to pay your credit card bills. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in 3 years. "Cordelia," she said finally, her voice artificially sweet but trembling with barely controlled rage. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. When I said you weren't being useful, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said, Ravenna. In front of my grandchildren, in front of the entire family, you called me useless. You said I was taking up space without contributing anything meaningful. Well, now you get to find out what meaningful contributions actually look like when they disappear." I hung up before she could respond, then called David Chen. "Phase 2, I said simply. David had been preparing for this moment all week. Within minutes, he had transferred funds to establish 2 separate million-dollar education trusts, one for Harmony, one for Phoenix. But these weren't ordinary trust funds. They came with very specific conditions that would govern every aspect of how the money could be used. The trustees I had selected were Marina Blackstone and David Chen, both professionals with no emotional investment in family drama, but with absolute commitment to the children's welfare. The trusts would pay for legitimate educational expenses, medical needs, and basic living requirements, but only with proper documentation and trustee approval. Most importantly, Jasper and Ravenna would have no access to the funds, no control over distribution decisions, and no ability to use the money for their own expenses. Every dollar would be tracked, every expenditure justified, and every decision made in the twins' best interests rather than their parents' convenience. The trust documents were delivered to their house that same afternoon, along with a letter explaining that while my mother called me useless, I was ensuring their children would never lack for educational opportunities or basic needs, regardless of their parents' financial management skills. But the real masterpiece was the social media strategy Rebecca Winters had helped me develop.
For years, Ravenna had been curating a perfect online image while simultaneously painting me as the difficult family member who created problems and required patient management. She had been controlling the narrative, using her social media presence to justify her treatment of me while showcasing a lifestyle funded by my contributions. That ended Tuesday evening when I created my own social media accounts. My first post was simple: a photo of the legal documents demanding repayment of the loans, with a caption that read, "After being called useless by family members at Easter dinner, I've decided to demonstrate exactly how useful my financial contributions have been over the past 5 years. Sometimes love looks like boundaries." The second post was a screenshot of the education trust documents, with the caption, "My grandchildren will never wonder if their grandmother loves them or believes in their potential. $2 million in education funding says more than words ever could." The third post was the most devastating: a side-by-side comparison of Ravenna's social media posts showing expensive purchases, luxury experiences, and perfect family moments dated immediately after each of my financial contributions to their family. Interesting how emergencies requiring financial assistance coincided so perfectly with social media posts about spa weekends, designer shopping trips, and luxury vacations. Perhaps emergency means something different than I thought. Within hours, these posts were being shared by people I'd lost touch with years ago, commented on by community members who had always wondered how a railroad worker's widow could afford such a modest lifestyle while apparently supporting an extended family's expensive tastes. But the nuclear option came Wednesday morning when Rebecca Winters delivered the final piece of her investigation: evidence that Ravenna had been claiming me as a dependent on their tax returns for the past 2 years, using my address as a secondary residence to claim benefits I had never authorized or received. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was tax fraud, identity theft, and financial abuse, all federal crimes with serious consequences.
I called Marina immediately. "File the criminal complaint," I said. "All of it. The fraud, the identity theft, the financial exploitation. I want the full legal weight of these violations on record." "Cordelia, are you sure? This will mean criminal charges, possible jail time, definitely public records that will affect their employment and creditworthiness for years." "Marina, they called me useless in front of my grandchildren after spending years stealing from me, lying about me, and systematically destroying my relationships with the people I love most. They used my love for those children as a weapon against me, and they used my money to fund the lifestyle they used to humiliate me." My voice was steady, calm, absolutely certain. They wanted to know what useful looks like. Now, they're going to learn what consequences look like when you abuse someone useful. By Wednesday afternoon, federal investigators were reviewing the complaint. By Thursday morning, Jasper and Ravenna's bank accounts were frozen, pending investigation. By Friday, their mortgage company had been notified of the criminal charges, triggering an immediate review of their loan status and creditworthiness. The woman they had dismissed as a useless burden had just dismantled their entire financial life in less than a week. But I wasn't finished. The education trusts, the criminal charges, the social media exposure, all of that was just the foundation for what would become the most comprehensive lesson in respect, consequences, and the true meaning of family that any of them had ever received. They had wanted to know how useful I could be. Now they are about to find out how expensive it had been to take that usefulness for granted. The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable precision of dominoes falling in a carefully constructed pattern. By the following Monday, exactly 10 days after that Easter dinner, the full scope of my response had created ripple effects that reached every corner of their carefully constructed life. The first domino was their mortgage. When the bank received notification of the federal investigation into tax fraud and identity theft, their automatic review protocols triggered an immediate reassessment of Jasper and Ravenna's loan status.
What the bank discovered was a couple whose debt-to-income ratio had only been sustainable because of undisclosed financial support from a family member, support that had now been formally withdrawn through legal demand letters. Marcus Weatherby from First National called them Tuesday morning to inform them that their mortgage was being called for immediate review and that they had 30 days to demonstrate their ability to maintain payments without external financial assistance. Given that my contributions had been covering nearly 40% of their monthly obligations, this was an impossible standard to meet. The second domino was Jasper's job. The criminal investigation into tax fraud required notification of his employer since financial crimes could affect his professional licensing in the financial services industry. Meridian Financial, the investment firm where he'd worked for 8 years, placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Even if the charges were eventually dropped or reduced, the mere existence of a federal investigation into his family's financial practices made him a liability in an industry built on trust and fiduciary responsibility. His clients' portfolios couldn't be managed by someone under investigation for financial fraud, regardless of the ultimate outcome. The third domino was their social standing in Elmwood Heights. The community where they'd built their identity as a successful, sophisticated family was small enough that news of federal investigations traveled faster than gossip. When your social currency is based on perceived wealth and status, criminal charges related to financial fraud destroy credibility in ways that take decades to rebuild. Ravenna's book club friends suddenly became unavailable for coffee dates. The country club, where they had been members for 5 years, quietly suggested that perhaps they should consider suspending their membership until their legal matters were resolved. Phoenix's private school sent a letter requesting immediate payment of all outstanding tuition fees, citing concerns about the family's ability to maintain their financial commitments. But the most devastating domino was the one I had specifically engineered: their complete dependence on my financial support becoming publicly visible just as that support disappeared entirely. David Chen had structured the trust funds and asset disclosures to create maximum contrast between my actual financial capacity and their assumption of my limitations. While they scrambled to explain how they would manage mortgage payments, car loans, credit card bills, and basic living expenses without my assistance, the documentation of my $2.3 million net worth made it impossible for them to claim they had been supporting a poor, elderly relative out of familial obligation. The narrative they had carefully constructed, successful young family graciously managing the burden of an aging dependent mother-in-law, crumbled when confronted with evidence that the burden had been subsidizing their lifestyle to the tune of over $3,000 a month, while building substantial wealth through her own financial acumen. Wednesday morning brought a call from Lydia, my daughter, who had been watching the situation unfold with what I could only describe as horrified fascination. "Mom," she said, her voice careful and slightly odd, "I had no idea about any of it. The money, the loans, what they had been saying about you."
I didn't want anyone to know about the money, sweetheart. I've always believed that family relationships should be based on love and respect, not financial calculations. But, Mom, why didn't you tell us what was happening, how they were treating you? I considered this question carefully, because I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I was more patient, more understanding, more generous, things would get better. I thought love could overcome manipulation if I just loved them enough. And now I understand that some people interpret kindness as weakness, generosity as obligation, and love as something they're entitled to without reciprocation. I spent 3 years trying to earn respect from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Harold Thornfield, Ravenna's father, appeared at my door in his expensive suit, carrying his usual air of financial authority, but looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Cordelia," he said, settling into my modest living room with obvious reluctance. I think we need to discuss this situation like reasonable adults. I served him coffee in one of my everyday mugs, not the good china I might have used in the past, and waited for him to continue. These legal actions you've taken are quite extensive, he said, consulting a leather portfolio he brought with him. The loan demands, the criminal complaints, the trust structures, very sophisticated financial maneuvering. Thank you, I said simply. I'm here to suggest that perhaps we can resolve this matter more amicably. Family disputes don't need to become legal battles, do they? I studied his face, recognizing the same calculating expression I'd seen on Ravenna's features so many times. What kind of resolution did you have in mind, Harold? Well, obviously, the loans you've documented represent legitimate family assistance that should be repaid. Perhaps we could establish a reasonable payment plan, something that wouldn't create undue hardship for the children. The children have $2 million in education trusts. I think their needs are adequately covered. Harold shifted uncomfortably. Yes, about those trusts. Very generous, but perhaps unnecessarily complicated. Wouldn't it be simpler to establish college funds that the parents could manage directly? And there it was, the same manipulation, one generation up the family tree. He wanted me to restructure the trusts, to give Jasper and Ravenna access to the money, to return control to the people who had been financially exploiting me for years. Harold, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate precision, your daughter called me useless in front of my grandchildren. She spent 3 years systematically isolating me from my family while she used my money to fund her lifestyle. She committed tax fraud by claiming me as a dependent while publicly portraying me as a financial burden. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden where I'd once taught my grandchildren about patience and growth. The trusts will remain exactly as structured, with professional trustees who have the children's best interests as their only priority. The loan demands will proceed as filed, with full legal enforcement if necessary, and the criminal investigation will continue to its conclusion, wherever that may lead. Harold's professional composure finally cracked. You're destroying this family over hurt feelings, Cordelia. You're letting pride and wounded ego tear apart relationships that should matter more than money. I turned back to face him, and he must have seen something in my expression that made him lean back in his chair. Harold, I spent 3 years watching your daughter tear apart my relationships with my son and grandchildren while she stole my money and lied about my character. I watched my family choose her version of reality over their own knowledge of who I am as a person. My voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of accumulated pain and carefully considered decision-making. This isn't about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This is about consequences for people who confused kindness with stupidity, who mistook love for weakness, and who assumed that someone they considered useless couldn't possibly have the resources or resolve to hold them accountable for their choices. Harold left without another word, his expensive briefcase and professional demeanor somehow looking smaller and less impressive than when he'd arrived. That evening, as I sat in my garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, I reflected on how completely the balance of power had shifted in just 2 weeks. The woman they had dismissed as a useless burden had systematically dismantled their financial security, their social standing, their professional credibility, and their ability to control the narrative about our family relationships. But more importantly, I had demonstrated to my grandchildren, who were watching all of this unfold with the sharp attention that children bring to adult drama, that love doesn't require you to accept mistreatment, that generosity shouldn't be confused with weakness, and that sometimes the people who care about you most
are the ones willing to set boundaries that protect everyone's long-term well-being. The woman who had once folded napkins into perfect swans, trying to earn her place at family dinners, had become someone who understood that respect isn't earned through accommodation. It's commanded through self-respect. And there was one more lesson left to teach.
6 months later, I sat in my transformed living room, sunlight streaming through new curtains that I'd finally allowed myself to purchase without worrying about the expense. The house on Maple Street had undergone its own quiet revolution. Fresh paint, updated appliances, a beautiful new deck overlooking the garden that had become my sanctuary during the most difficult months. But the most profound changes weren't visible in the physical space. They lived in the quality of silence that now filled my days, the absence of anxiety that had plagued me for 3 years, the return of something I'd almost forgotten: peace. The legal proceedings had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Jasper and Ravenna had ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges, financial fraud, and filing false tax returns, avoiding jail time in exchange for full restitution, 3 years of probation, and 500 hours of community service. The mortgage company had foreclosed on their Elmwood Heights colonial, and they'd moved into a modest rental duplex on the other side of town. Jasper had found new employment with a smaller firm, his salary significantly reduced, but his professional license intact. Ravenna had taken a part-time job at a local boutique, her social media presence now notably absent of luxury purchases and exotic experiences. But the most important transformation was one that surprised everyone, including me. My grandchildren had asked to see me. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in September. Phoenix's voice on the phone, serious and careful in the way that 8-year-olds sound when they're trying to navigate complex adult emotions. "Grandma Cordelia, it's Phoenix. Can Harmony and I come visit you this weekend? Mom said we could ask, but only if you want to see us." The question broke something open in my chest that I'd been protecting for months. Of course I wanted to see them. I had wanted to see them every single day since that Easter dinner. But I'd refused to compromise my boundaries, even for the sake of relationships that meant everything to me. "I would love to see you both," I told him. "Very much. We have some things we want to talk to you about." Harmony's voice chimed in from the background. "Important things." Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes everything feel possible again. I prepared for their visit the way I used to prepare for holidays. Special cookies, fresh flowers from my garden, activities planned but not forced. When Jasper dropped them off, our interaction was civil but careful. He looked older, worn down by the consequences of choices that had seemed so reasonable when I was the one absorbing their costs. "Mom," he said quietly as the twins ran ahead to explore the changes I'd made to the house, "I want you to know that we've been talking about everything. About how we treated you, about what we assumed, about what we took for granted." I nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Some conversations require more than words to heal what's been broken. "The kids have been asking a lot of questions," he continued. "About money, about family, about why things happened the way they did. We've tried to be honest with them, age-appropriately." "What kind of questions?" "Harmony asked why you thought you were poor when you had so much money saved. Phoenix wanted to know why Mommy said you were useless when you were paying for their music lessons and our car payments." The pain in his voice was genuine, and for the first time in months, I saw glimpses of the son I'd raised, rather than the man Ravenna had influenced him to become. After he left, the twins and I spent the afternoon in my garden, harvesting the last tomatoes of the season and talking about school, friends, and the small adventures that make up a child's world. But as the sun began to set, Phoenix approached the conversation I suspected had been the real purpose of their visit. "Grandma Cordelia," he said, settling beside me on the garden bench that overlooked the vegetable plots,
We know what happened at Easter dinner. Harmony joined me, her small face serious with the weight of understanding that had come too early. We know that Mommy said mean things about you, and that's why you couldn't see us anymore. I looked at my grandchildren, these beautiful, thoughtful children who had been caught in the middle of an adult conflict they hadn't created or deserved, and felt the full complexity of love that transcends even the deepest betrayals. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Sometimes we hurt people we love, and sometimes those hurts have consequences that affect everyone in the family. But you weren't really useless, Phoenix said with 8-year-old logic. You were paying for lots of stuff. You were helping us all the time. And you weren't poor either, Harmony. You have more money than anybody we know, but you still lived in this little house and drove that old car. Why? These questions.
But they thought you needed help, not that you were helping them, Phoenix observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. Yes, sometimes people see what they expect to see instead of what's really there. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the evening light fade across the garden. Then Harmony asked the question that mattered most. Are you still mad at us for what Mommy said? I turned to face both of them, these children who carried my son's eyes and their grandfather's curiosity, who had inherited not just DNA, but the capacity for kindness that could survive even the worst examples of adult behavior. I was never mad at you, I said firmly, not for one single minute. I was hurt by your parents' choices, and I had to protect myself from being treated badly, but I never stopped loving you or wanting to be your grandmother. So, we can visit you again? Phoenix asked hopefully. You can visit me any time your parents agree to bring you. And someday, when you're older, you'll be able to visit me whenever you want to because you'll have your own money and your own cars and your own choices to make. That evening, after Jasper picked them up and the house settled back into its peaceful quiet, I reflected on the strange mathematics of love and loss, of boundaries and reconciliation. I had lost 3 years of easy family relationships, but I had gained something more valuable. The knowledge that I could survive being rejected by people I loved, that my worth wasn't dependent on their recognition, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behaviors. The money had been important, not just the wealth I had accumulated, but the strategic way I'd used it to demonstrate consequences and establish boundaries. But the real victory had been more subtle. I had reclaimed my right to be treated with respect. My grandchildren had learned that love doesn't require accepting mistreatment, and my family had been forced to confront the true cost of taking someone for granted. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from Ravenna. Not a text message or email, but an actual handwritten letter on plain stationery, no monogrammed letterhead, no expensive paper, just blue ink on white pages filled with words that must have been extraordinarily difficult to write. The letter was long, detailed, and as close to a genuine apology as someone like Ravenna was probably capable of offering. She acknowledged her manipulation, her financial exploitation, her systematic campaign to isolate me from my family. She took responsibility for turning my generosity into an expectation, my love into a weapon against me. But more importantly, she asked for something she'd never requested before, the chance to earn back a place in my life through actions rather than words. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with other important documents. It would take time to evaluate whether her intentions matched her words, whether this represented genuine change or strategic repositioning for another attempt at manipulation. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt hope that my grandchildren might grow up in a family where love and respect operated as partners rather than enemies, where financial support came with gratitude rather than entitlement, where being useful meant being valued rather than being used. The woman who had once been called useless had taught everyone around her exactly how valuable usefulness really is, and how expensive it becomes when you take it for granted. And in my quiet house on Maple Street, surrounded by the fruits of 15 years of careful planning and patient investing, I finally understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the experience of learning to live without you. Sometimes love looks like boundaries. Sometimes wisdom looks like consequences. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept less than you deserve.
At 67 years old, I had finally learned to be useful to the person that mattered most, myself.